I didn't talk to John about his intro, but it's funny because I grew up in Detroit, so I know that story very well. And then my daughter was born in Knoxville, so I also know the Chattanooga story pretty well too. So if we want to get into any of those, it's a good conversation. So today, we're really going to look broadly at the main changes being proposed, why we are pursuing these sorts of changes. Most of these are fundamental to the difference between what a form-based code is and what conventional or use-based codes are. We might use those terms interchangeably a little bit. Today you have a code that is mostly use-based, but you do have some form-based portions. Downtown, some of those districts being used in Midtown and Uptown. And we're looking to move towards a code that is mostly form-based with some use-based portions for areas like the industrial zones. So there's always a mix, it's just changing that balance, right? Now, we're not going to get into all the specifics. We're zoning nerds. I'm happy to talk to anybody about as much zoning specifics as you want, but that's eyes glaze over territory for most folks. So we'll look at the real purposes and outcomes out of this, and then ask you for your thoughts on some of those primary elements. Mainly, we want to clarify how form-based codes work. You may be partly familiar because you have some of that here, but the main differences is what we want to point out, and why we write them that way, how that actually helps when we're using it more broadly to manage compatibility. And that's something that Juliet talked a little bit about in terms of transitions. Well, transitions to us are really about compatibility, and how that may differ from how the current code works. So the why at the heart of form-based codes is really predictability, right? Aligning expectations with outcomes. Now, the comprehensive gross policy and zoning, now to most people that's pretty confusing, right? And most zoning codes are very, very inaccessible, full of wordy requirements that have no clear connection to build outcomes. Well, we have to have a growth map, and we have to have zoning, and they have to be separate documents. That's just how the system works. It can be confusing, but right now this combined rewrite will direct the most important aspects of new development. Instead of being reactive, being proactive to direct the outcomes. And so I'll say that a whole bunch. And it does that through form. Now, a Main Street place type, like this drawing, in the growth map, that really evokes an expectation of where buildings would be located, how tall they are, what sorts of uses are in those buildings, and how people will inhabit that area. And a neighborhood node place type in the growth map has a different character and a different set of expectations. And it's important in this discussion, too, to say we don't think that the future of Rogers is downtown everywhere, right? It's about this granularity of having the right type of growth in the right place. And that's the connection between the growth map and the zoning code. And also explaining what we intend for the transformation of other places that are special, like Walnut, for example. From today, a commercial strip that really doesn't evoke the character of the city, to a place that we hope in the future the community can love, and is more readily achieved this understanding with pictures like these than just words and policy and regulation. And so with these changes to both the growth map and the zoning code, we're moving away from being reactive to development and towards directing those outcomes. That's a really important change. So interestingly enough, even here and elsewhere, but earlier in February, I think, when we spoke to a number of developers, they've really been excited at the prospect of being directed more clearly. They want to see this sort of change because we're trading uncertainty and unpredictability for clarity, and that's good for both the city and the development community. And the form-based code is a critical element of that for the growth that we'll see in coming decades. Now, the form-based approach is critical to ensuring zoning regulations produce those expectations. As we'll discuss in more detail, the tools of conventional codes, those use-based codes, they tend to produce unpredictable results. So on the left in this diagram, conventional codes rely on buffers and setting buildings back from the streets and from neighboring properties. And they do this to address potential conflicts with neighboring properties. But they do that because they don't know what any of those are going to be. They don't have a goal. On the other hand, the form-based codes first decide where the buildings should be and where the parking should be, how big the buildings are, and they address compatibility by transitioning between big buildings that are close to the street to medium-sized buildings that are a little bit away from the street to smaller buildings that are further away from the street still. And so while form-based codes are not as critical in existing neighborhoods, most future growth will not be in your existing neighborhoods, right? So they're really critical in controlling the form in the places where we're going to see growth and how that transitions from existing neighborhoods to areas that growth is going to occur. So conventional codes, these use-based codes, they rely on use and density, or the amount of commercial building area, FAR as it's usually used, and those are the primary ways that development is controlled. Now each site here is considered independent of each other, independent of its neighbors, and completely, the results essentially are incoherent and an inefficient form of development. There's not a cohesive vision. Instead, everything is individual, and you just don't know what's going to happen. So you've got to protect against every possible outcome, right? But if we start with a vision, it's a different way forward. So, this is not just your code, right? It's not just in Rogers. This is why most of America, as I said, looks the same once you're outside of older downtowns and once you're not yet quite to the rural areas, right? So most of those suburban commercial strips are essentially the same. It's a huge waste of space, and as you heard from Joe, a huge waste of money. And there's lots of redundant driveways, too much parking, wasted buffers in the wrong place. While conventional codes have setbacks and building height requirements, they're very loose. Setbacks don't add up to places because buildings can really be located anywhere. And height then is very restricted because there's no way to tell if you allow a big building, is it going to be close to a neighbor that it would be incompatible with or not? Because we're not controlling where those buildings sit on their sites. So not only is this result not efficient or attractive, it's impossible to walk, impossible to bike, and where you do have public transit, which is rare, it's also very ineffective. It can't really work in this sort of context. So on the other hand, the form-based approach begins with the intended outcome of the place, right? And then it aligns the requirements for where buildings and parking are located, any potential restrictions on buildings. Downtowns and other centers and main streets, they're pretty similar in that buildings should be close to the street and should be built next to each other. However, building heights in downtown should be different than uptown, and main streets and neighborhood nodes are smaller even. But while addressing building form, use and density are less important, right? For instance, in downtown and uptown, the use of the buildings may change over time. What matters is where the buildings are located and how they relate to each other, not so much what's happening inside of them. Even among townhomes, for example, as a type, density can be very, very different. Is there a garage attached or detached? Are they wide or not? The numbers just go crazy, and I'll show that in a little more detail. But the point is that identifying the outcomes and building that form as the basis of regulating development is what creates predictability and how we can really help the public understand the character of what the outcomes of development will be in the future. Now, so what do we do to make these changes? One is deprioritizing use. So because conventional codes attempt to manage compatibility on a use-by-use basis, the number of uses just grows and grows and grows over time in order to provide additional restrictions or make adjustments for an unanticipated use. Now, eventually, this results in unintentional limitations, and those often make it difficult for new uses that we didn't anticipate to find a suitable location to open businesses. So this diagram is not here, but you're not that far off. But the process we take is what we really want to show here. The process we take to reduce uses into much more simple categories. As you can imagine, comprehending and administering a code with the uses on the left side of this diagram is very complicated. And again, it's not Rogers, it's not far off, and it's common for most conventional codes. When you focus on use and you have no idea what is going to be next to it, then your compatibility by use just balloons your use list. It gets really, really complicated. And so our goal is to reduce the number of uses to really only those categories that make a practical difference in where you may want to allow or restrict uses, like hotels or offices, but we don't need to get into all the minutiae. and then any specific impacts that should be considered. But there's no reason to differentiate, say, a barber shop from a salon. Happens all the time, right? Or kids' clothing from women's clothing, from general clothing retailers. And it makes no difference, but we find these in most codes. So diving into the minutia of different uses, it just doesn't help determine if that use is going to be compatible with its surroundings. And when it comes down to it, that's really what the code is there for, to ensure compatibility between neighboring properties. So you may not be able to read this a lot. Don't worry about the diagram so much. The point is that there's a main street. There's a main street for a block, right? This isn't here, but this example is about collapsing uses. This one block main street with 17 businesses has 13 different use categories. But they're all right up next to each other. They're compatible. For most of these, there's really no reason to have that distinction between those categories. The main thing is that they're at a main street and the buildings are similar and work together, and those uses might change over time. And so in this case, we collapsed the uses, and we really only needed 4. Retail, office, food and beverage, and big box retail. And those are important, those specific ones, because we may want to control where those uses are around the city, but we don't need to get into the minutia of all the different types of office or all the different types of retail. We don't really care if a retailer is selling clothing or jewelry. That's not important to the outcomes of development. So here's another way to look at the same. Coffee shops in different contexts. So here's the coffee shop you probably know. We can note it's a single-story building by itself with parking surrounding it and a drive-through. Not all coffee shops have these characteristics. The building form and parking placement are important. If you built this in downtown, it wouldn't make any sense. And in fact, that would be damaging. But here's a coffee shop in a different context, a historic home converted to a business. The building also wouldn't make much sense in downtown. It also wouldn't make much sense where the last coffee shop was located either, but it fits pretty well into a small-scale neighborhood center, along with a few other small businesses perhaps. This type of neighborhood business is certainly more appropriate near low-scale homes than a downtown building would be, or even the prior coffee shop with the drive-through. The low-scale building, setbacks in line with nearby homes, and the fact that it doesn't have a large parking lot help it fit in. And those are all prioritized by looking at form first before use. So here's a coffee shop in downtown. The cafe is distinguished from the prior mainly because it's attached to other businesses, it's close to the street, and even has a very high ceiling. If this building was set back really far with a side driveway or large parking lot, it wouldn't fit in downtown. And those are all things that we control with form. So you can run a coffee shop in all sorts of buildings and all sorts of contexts, but you can't take the downtown building and locate it in place of most of the other cafes we've seen, especially the one in the house. And while we're looking at it, this is also a coffee shop. So the point is that use is just not a good predictor of compatibility. And as a result, form-based codes deprioritize that use. In the form-based code, the height of the buildings, its setbacks, parking location, the amount of activity within a site, those are controlled first. And then the particulars of use are addressed secondarily. So simplifying the uses actually reduces the burden on businesses and building owners. And the specific use in a tenant space, it changes over time. The shop in downtown might close, a restaurant opens in it. What matters is that it's a downtown building. So how buildings relate to their scale and how they differ between downtown and uptown, along Walnut, Olive, New Hope, Dixieland, and for future neighborhood main streets, as well as within neighborhoods, old ones and new ones that we'll see. In addressing these contexts, the form-based codes will help deal with compatibility, dial in that compatibility. And we'll look at that in a moment. Now, the fun part on density. It turns out density is also a poor predictor of the character of development and of compatibility. For all the grief that we get over density, it's horribly misunderstood in most places. I've designed personally lots of developments and buildings within developments. I've also analyzed historic neighborhoods and historic downtowns across the country. Density numbers in regulations typically have no connection with reality, nothing to do whatsoever with reality. So this example here, these all represent a property of the same size. They're all the same density, but they occupy the site totally differently. So you could hypothetically, in the top left, have 4 single-family detached homes that are fairly large. These are 3,000 square feet. And those occupy a lot more of the property than the bottom right, which is a multifamily building with 4 units. And the bottom left is 2 duplexes. Top right is 4 smaller houses. And they all occupy that property very differently. They all relate to each other very differently. And it's not about their density, it's really about the form of the building that manages how they sort of fit into their context. And so to demonstrate that, consider these pictures, right? Sure, there's a difference clearly between a single-family house and a large apartment building, but what is the density of each of these? You know, look at that and try to take your guess. One of these is 74 units to the acre, another is 44 units to the acre, a third is 25, and the lowest one is 14 units to the acre. So which is which? You probably didn't guess that the lower left is the most dense. 74 units to the acre looks like townhouses, right? Similarly, if I didn't give you the numbers, you'd probably guess that the large single-family house wouldn't be 14 units to the acre. And personally, I would have guessed that that big apartment building would be more than 44 units to the acre, right? But there's other elements that affect that affect the outcomes and that affect density. So one of those elements is the size of the property, the amount of land that's dedicated to parking, the amount of land that's dedicated to open space. There are options for gentle density, like the 14 unit per acre house is that high because it has an accessory dwelling as part of it. And so that increases the density number. So the point here, though, is that the density doesn't predict the character. I would personally not like to see that 44 unit apartment building built just about anywhere. But that 74 unit set of buildings that look like townhomes, those could fit in pretty well as a transition from a downtown context to a sort of corridor context before you get into neighborhoods. Now, having better context around density is important as we discuss making housing more affordable. We heard a lot about this in February from all sorts of folks about the affordability of housing. Now, the primary way we make housing more affordable is making housing smaller and providing more dwelling units in the same building and the same size of property. Now, this chart shows trends in apartment size and rent over the past decade and change. It's a couple of years out of date, but they've kind of continued this path. And this has a major implication on density restrictions. And this is critical for Rogers, as we discussed. If you want to stop growth in agricultural areas and preserve natural areas and preserve existing neighborhoods, then the places where growth is directed by the CGM need to allow density numbers higher than what you probably think is reasonable. But most people don't really understand what those numbers mean in the outcome, and that's why density itself is not a good control, but form is a better control. Now the chart, just to explain why that's there, the orange line is showing the average size of a housing unit. This is in rentals. So the average size of a rental housing unit over time has been going down while the cost has been going up. And so this is continued. So it's not to say that having smaller apartments ends up getting you cheaper housing. We have to really cut that off. But if we restrict that density to something unreasonable and don't focus on the form, what we end up getting is more units that are bigger and more expensive over time. So here's some examples. These are in my neighborhood, not here again, but historic buildings in my neighborhood that have always been 2 units and 4 units. And these are mixed single-family homes. But just to point out that 32 units per acre, that 4-unit apartment building, it's not really that dense. And particularly as apartments and condos get smaller. The other one on your right, the duplex, is 17 units per acre. And that's pretty close to looking like a big house. It meets the setbacks. The others, houses around it, has a porch just like surrounding homes. Now, we're not here intending to add these sorts of buildings to existing neighborhoods, just pointing out that having this sort of building stock is a viable way to add density in a gentle manner, and it's better controlled by form than it is by limiting the number of units per acre. So far too often we see a goal based on the form, a goal of an outcome based on the form, a vision that the community wants to see, but the density numbers that are there ingrained in the code, they don't allow it to happen. not even come close to happening. And frequently the lack of sufficient density means that in the end a good project won't pencil, and so the community gets the worst outcome as a result. So last one on this subject matter, but consider the diagram from the previous slide, a little bit before. So these 2 quarter-acre properties could easily range in a density from 4 units to 16 units per acre without changing the form of the building at all. Now, the same amount of yard space, the same setbacks, maybe you'd have a few more cars to park at 16 units the acre, but probably these lots of single-family homes would have more cars anyways, right? So the important thing with that is that the cars are just not in between the building and the street, and that's something that we control by form. So to reiterate, our goal is not to change the existing neighborhood in any substantial way, but instead we're looking to infill corridors, shopping centers, other properties that are not principally single-family neighborhoods, and to diversify the new growth areas so they accommodate more houses, more businesses, and so that they're more efficient with infrastructure. And that's infrastructure you have to maintain in perpetuity. So in writing codes, we can fine-tune these standards, and we ask what size is the building and how much is appropriate in different locations, and how do we transition. That's what we're dialing in with the code. And in terms of what's appropriate where, that's because form-based codes don't just produce downtowns, as I've said. The amount of detail it addresses can be tuned very finely. So for most places, we want the minimum amount of standards to ensure that buildings are similarly sized, they relate to the street in a similar way. In downtown, however, we may want to, it may be prudent to add more specific requirements to ensure that buildings respect the historic character, right? So a place like downtown, maybe we need a few more requirements than we might need on Walnut. So exactly how much we require and where and to what detail we get into is the fine-tuning of the codes. But that is place by place and built on the form standards first, and then we can get into more details where it's appropriate. So in addition to smaller properties, right, quite a lot of development is going to continue to occur on large properties. These developments require new streets, they require open space, and they have to be compatible with adjacent properties. And these sorts of requirements and considerations, they fall under subdivision regulations, and they're evaluated by reviewing development site plans, right? In most cases, and presently in Rogers, the zoning code and subdivision regulations are not well coordinated. And as we'll discuss with conventional zoning, most subdivision standards are not built with an outcome in mind, right? They're not building towards a vision. So they're not well coordinated because they're located in different documents, they may be under different departments. So in the form-based code, there's a term, Unified Development Ordinance. We don't need all the planarese, just we'll say the form-based code that addresses all of development. It solves this by putting both the zoning and subdivision together so that you know holistically the outcome of development will follow the pattern that's expected. So to demonstrate this connection, this is also not from here, very high scale place, but the scale actually, interestingly, is similar to Uptown, to what you're seeing in Uptown. And so that's big buildings. Not most of Rogers, but Uptown you're certainly seeing it. So this sort of development intensity, just like Uptown up against the highway, not buffering neighborhoods. We'll take a look at this case. You have a site, and how do standards for development from a form-based perspective format that development to meet expectations. So the first step here really is dividing a larger site, into blocks that are walkable and providing for stormwater and open space. The revised subdivision requirements, they set a maximum dimension for blocks, so they're not too big, because smaller blocks are easier for people on foot and by bike to get around, and large blocks you just can't walk. So most sites would be required to connect to adjacent properties that either haven't been developed or to extend existing road stubs. And those are actually critical steps, interestingly, to reduce traffic by providing a variety of different options to get around instead of concentrating everybody directly onto the big roads. And it's also helpful for life safety, which benefits from having multiple means around the city. You know, you really have a hard time getting fire trucks and ambulances everywhere when streets don't connect. So then the subdivision standards also define where the size, location, use, and type of open space is regulated. Open space that you see typically is just on the sort of outsides of properties, and that really doesn't help the city much. It's kind of wasteful unless you need to buffer, and there's standards specifically for that. But when it's well-formed and integrated with development, it enriches people's daily lives with recreation and interaction. And we've seen in Rogers, while benefiting from great trails and parks that you do have, you don't have all that much usable open space near most of the homes. And so we want to ensure that open space that is developed in new development is usable for those around it. And those new standards, as part of that, can demand less open space overall, but require that it's designed to be more usable, right? We can still let people build as much dribbly edge open space as they want, but if it doesn't produce something that's usable for existing residents, for future residents, then it's not something that we are going to worry about regulating. We're just going to regulate that usable open space. Subdivision standards also regulate streets, pedestrian walkways, other means of getting around. Streets are extremely important to get right, because if we want the city to be more walkable and bikeable, which follows in the historic path of Rogers, then we need to ensure that the streets are connected and that there's coordination between the character of street and the character of development. A downtown street doesn't make sense in neighborhoods, and a neighborhood street doesn't make sense in downtown. And finally, again, this is uptown, so not everywhere. This is uptown. Finally, the zoning regulations for building fill in blocks and properties with the form intended. So the point is really that the site is structured into blocks and open space, and then buildings following that character are built where the zoning and subdivision meet. Subdivision manages streets, parks, lotting, and then zoning the buildings, and we want to coordinate all the characteristics of these between both documents. So here's a look at a large development site in Rogers, a first sketch that we need to continue to work on, of what a neighborhood main street and neighborhood buffer place types might look like in terms of development. Here we're looking at requirements to connect to existing street stubs, to orient more intensive development towards the main road corridor, and other sites that are buffers, and then to transition downwards in intensity towards the adjacent neighborhood. So more intensity towards the corridor and transition in scale and intensity towards existing neighborhoods. Here we're also looking at open space with a goal of providing open space in the forms of parks and playgrounds as you'd normally recognize them, and again, not dribbled on the edge of the site. Here's a smaller site, and you see here I say directing outcomes. The goal is to direct what we want to see, but it's really for most developments, right? So here's a neighborhood node in the growth map on a property that's about 5 acres. And so we're looking here at how to best transition to the adjacent neighborhood, how commercial or mixed use is located along the street, but not internal to the property, yet how the property can be developed to improve walkability, housing availability, and also make money because it's got a pencil in the end. And here's a site in between the two in terms of size. This one is within 2 different place types. In this case, it's on a state highway where on-street parking can't be added to slow traffic. So we're looking at those specifics. And so as a result there, we look to buffer the neighborhoods from the corridor with townhomes perhaps, set the corner main street uses. They might have to be back from the road because we don't have on-street parking. And you can't put buildings right up to the street when you don't have on-street parking. So what are the allowances there to ensure a cohesive development environment? So a little parking in front, little bit in back, streets connected, open space in the middle. But the point is trying to deal with these adjacencies, and how do we deal with those adjacencies? That's through the Transect, and which is planner speak, a wonky word, and we may not use the term, and so that's something to think about. But the concept's important. The Transect is a way that compatibility can be coordinated between different intensities of development, between private development, infrastructure, and public investments. The Transect categorizes development according to an intensity, and we just use numbers here because it can be applied different places. It's a scale from 1 to 6. 6 is essentially uptown, and 1 is the natural environment. And so it's a declension of intensity in between the least intense natural areas and the most intense built-up areas. So we call these transect zones, and they're the basis for how we're forming most of the new zones for Rogers. Whether we use the term transect or not, it's really about intensity and knowing how intense a place is as opposed to places near it. Now, it's not importing standards from elsewhere, really. Rather, this is a means of evaluating types of places that exist in Rogers already, or if none exist elsewhere in Northwest Arkansas. And the concept is really built on how all American towns and cities were originally built before the codes of the 50s that we've seen building suburban sprawl have taken place. So from the least developed areas, there's T1, as I mentioned. There's T2, which covers rural and agricultural areas. T3 is suburban single-family areas. T4 is that sort of edge between mostly single-family and downtowns, where you've kind of got a mix of different sizes of houses. You may have some townhouses and small apartments. And then T5 for main streets and downtowns, and T6 for the really intensive areas. But as a categorization system, the Transect helps us coordinate and transition scale and intensity from the more intense places to the less intense places. So this is an image, the 1946 Rogers, and it gives us a glimpse into the Transect. It's just how most cities and towns were built historically, had evolved naturally. And it's not always linear, but for the most part it is. And the concept really was developed to analyze places like Rogers historically. T5 in downtown is really along Walnut here. T4 is the neighborhoods close in, and those generally have smaller properties. T3, the neighborhoods further out with larger properties. And T2, the agricultural areas, which are mostly outside of this picture, and T1, the natural areas. And so development across the US from the 50s to today has been shaped by a set of essentially nationwide standards that are no different from one place to the other. And so as much as possible, the goal is to learn from the character here as the basis for new growth. Now, we can't ever get Rogers back to this, but we can have a future that we all look forward to with hope and goals for growth and children for the city that carries forth the character of Rogers. And that's something we want to work with you all to tweak. See what exactly that is. Make sure things are locally. Build it off of the local DNA. And so the Transect works by collecting all the details of a place at these different intensities. And then aligning the different standards, the requirements in zoning and subdivision according to that intensity. And in the most intense places, like uptown, there's more people, so sidewalks have to be wider. There's more businesses, so the streets need parking. And there's more activities going on with each building, so the buildings are larger. But towards the opposite end in T2, there's fewer users and essentially nobody walking to get to services and shops. So it's a totally different environment. So here there may be shared bike and walking trail in the more rural areas, but those are probably separated from the street, right? And they're not everywhere. Buildings are lower in height and located much further away from roads. So everything's along a spectrum from the sort of least intense to most intense, the details of sites, buildings, streets, and open spaces. So I personally like this slide as a different way to look at the concept of the Transect, where in T1 at sort of the top middle, or T2, you have these rural fences. If you built that downtown, would it make sense? No. And if you had, let's say, a brick wall, putting a brick wall around your farm, that doesn't make any sense either, right? So it's the right thing in the right place, all the details of the built environment. And the way that allows us to deal with compatibility is a situation like this, where we say, clearly, this is not compatible. Like these two places are not compatible with each other. On one side, we have a low scale, single-family home that we'd categorize in T3 across the street, this big building, T6. Boom, right away we know that they don't work together. And so we wouldn't allow those to be next to each other. And if they were, we'd have to have some serious buffering requirements. It really helps us to anticipate compatibility between different uses. But when you have the same thing on both sides of the street, you know, the same T-zone, here's T5 in like a downtown condition. Same thing if you had T3 from T3, single family from single family. We know that those are going to be compatible. And we're really focused on compatibility in the zoning code, especially as we're looking towards growth. So as part of this framework with the Transect, we're looking to reduce the number of total zoning districts that you have. Just like uses, when you have use as a basis, you get so many of them. And also when you have density as a basis of zoning, you end up with a lot of zones because neither are really good at predicting compatibility. So for a city the size of Rogers, you really have an unusually large number of zoning districts. It's very strange. And many of them are really close to each other in intensity, but also they zone by tenure, which is, you know, if it's owned or rented, which is probably not legally defensible. But after analyzing all your districts...
Excuse me, we have a question over
yeah.
here. Can you define what tenure is?
Oh, sure. Oh, it said whether it's owned or rented. Yeah. So you have, here there's zones that have a density number, and then I think it's like a C or a...
A-B.
Oh, A and B. A and B, which is renter or owner, and like, it's not entirely legal in most places. So you probably can't defend that. Yeah, but after analyzing these districts and considering which may be transition to the Transect framework and a few that would need to stay single use, we think that you could reduce the existing zones down to 25% of what you have right now by focusing on form and not focusing on the things that we're presently focusing on. So instead of 57 zones, it's 14. And so that vastly simplifies staff's job in administering the code. It makes it easier for developers, but it also makes it easier for residents, right? They're going to understand better what might be built near them. So with this approach, we can better control where growth happens, especially in the commercial corridors and within other appropriate areas where we're aiming for growth within the comprehensive growth map. Absorbing growth here reduces in these areas reduces the impact that it'll have on existing neighborhoods, on rural areas, on natural areas. That's our goal of providing for intensity, but we want to control it in a way that makes sense and is predictable, and therefore the connection between the place types in the comprehensive growth map and the zoning, the Transect zones, so that we can clearly have a clear set of outcomes. These illustrations that may look pretty, well, we can make them happen so long as we have a coordinated system. Now, the last little thing, you don't have to look at the details, but streamlining processes is important. This is a really important piece of this, but it requires having that predictability built into everything, right? By directing the outcome of development, it's easier to create a more streamlined process. We've heard from developers here, we've heard from regional advocates that the current approvals processes are cumbersome. But that's typical of most places that have conventional zoning and conventional subdivision codes. Because of the lack of predictability of those codes and the lack of baked-in transition requirements, because they can't really manage transition by use or density, then every single project has to have a high degree of scrutiny. But instead, by directing outcomes specifically, most applications, especially applications for smaller sites, they should be able to be processed in an expedited fashion, ideally administratively, if they're not seeking a rezone. Now, larger developments anywhere should still require more substantial review and public review. However, when we have clear rules for those as well, that process becomes simpler. So making the process clear, easy, and quick is an important way to get better outcomes, and time and money in those cases can be spent more on the development as opposed to the uncertainty of the approvals process. So it all sort of works together to make development easier, but to get the outcomes that are clear, to say, here's the outcomes we want, and we're clear about what we want, so we can make it easy to achieve. And that both affects the character of the outcomes and the ability to develop more affordably. And in this, at the end, we'll ask for guidance in our discussions. There are a number of things that I spoke about here. The approach to focusing less on use and reducing the number of uses. Does that make sense? Focusing on form over density as a predictor of outcomes. Does that make sense? How much detail should the code get into and where? Should we really dial into downtown to make sure that new development is compatible in character with existing development with the historic character? How much control do we want to have on Walnut? How much in Midtown? Certainly we're not controlling that in most places, but there may be some places where you want to have a little bit more fine-grained control. What sorts of transitions are important, especially as we look to protect neighborhoods and grow in places where it makes sense? Does the transect make sense? Is the term useful, or is it too wonky? It's always hard to find like a better term for us. We're not the marketing people, but the strategy is very important. And how streamlined can we make the approvals process? So I can shut up now. After all that, I'm sure I went way over my time. But we did want to say, in here we're talking about the goals of the code, and we're looking to get towards a first draft in fall and moving towards adoption towards the end of the year. So we're at the beginning of this process and want to get your input. So that's what I got.